We are continuing our sermon series called You're Not Christian. We're in week 5 of it. If you have not liked it, if you have been offended by it, if you've been challenged by it, to this point, buckle up for today as we're tackling this idea and concept called grace versus truth. And just as a reminder, if you haven't been with us, we've been kind of approaching this idea of you're not Christian because the word Christian was actually never applied by Christians to themselves. That was a term that the outside world applied to them as actually a derogatory term originally. And it stuck for years, and to be honest, there's nothing particularly wrong with it, except for the fact that because it's not defined in the Bible, you can be a Christian and believe and do anything that you want. Right? So as we've kind of talked about over these past 4 weeks, you can be a Christian and you can be on any side of any political issue. I mean, Christians have been both sides of wars that have gone on for hundreds of years, right? In fact, there was one war between Christians that lasted 100 years, right? Christians on both sides. And so because Christian's not defined, we thought it would be more helpful to think about what was the term they used for themselves in the early church as believers, and what was the term that Jesus used, and of course, he called them disciples. And the thing that we have been really wrestling with these past 4 weeks is this idea and concept. Jesus said it's really kind of simple. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. So Jesus calls us very specifically to love. And we've looked at the different ways that that might come into flesh, so to speak, in our lives over the last few weeks. And today we're going to kind of tackle something that I think is kind of difficult. Actually, it's not kind of difficult. It is difficult. And I would suggest to you it might be the most important as well as the most difficult aspect of being a disciple. And I had this kind of interesting experience. This past week we had our professional church workers, including pastors conference, and prior to that, we had a conference for what's called the circuit visitors. So our district's divided into circuits and their leaders, and I'm the one of the northeast, and so I had to be at this conference. And as soon as I got done with it, I had to go and teach 8th graders in confirmation that night. And I was remarking just by myself. I was laying in bed on Thursday morning, and I thought, wow. My pastors that I were with are as bad at what I'm about to talk about as my 8th graders are. And I include myself in that group of pastors. And what I'm talking about is the tension that exists in Christianity, right? And I don't know, maybe you grew up in the faith, maybe you saw this in the life of Jesus, maybe you grew up in church and it kind of has never crossed your mind, but if you were to step kind of back a little bit and just to look at the stories of the gospel, you would have to admit that you see Jesus acting very inconsistently, wouldn't you? Right? Times where he's just very gracious, he's very forgiving to people, and then other times he has these biting words, right? And how do we kind of reconcile what that looks like? And I'd suggest to you that it's this tension that we have and exists as Christianity that's actually important. In fact, I'm going to suggest to you that by the end of this, maybe you'll agree with me, if you try to resolve that tension, if you try to fix it, you will break Christianity. You'll break what it means to be a disciple. And then, in fact, what we have to do instead of trying to resolve it is to embrace it. And to kind of get us there, I want to look at the words that Pastor Mark read from the book of John. So if you don't know the background on this, by the time John writes his 3 letters, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and his gospel, along with the book of Revelation, he's probably the last living disciple. All the others have been are dead, and from what we know of Christian tradition, they've been actually put to death. And so John is the last one who's left, and he's been, teaching the early church. They always have questions, and he's gonna get getting up there in age, and it had to be, some guy drew the short straw, and they're like, you need to go ask John to write this stuff down, because he's not getting any younger, right? And so, however it happened, we reached this point where John is reflecting back on his life with Jesus, what it meant to be one of his disciples, and what's, I don't know if you ever thought about this, the other accounts are all written relatively close to when the events happened, right? And they're kind of just told in that manner. But John's able to reflect for something like 40 or 50 years on what happened with Jesus before he writes his gospel down. And so what he does is this kind of amazing thing. He starts from the big picture, way, way back, right? And he says that in the beginning was God's word. And he actually comes along and says this. He says he, Jesus, was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. You may have heard me say this before if I've been teaching on this. I actually think verse 11 is one of the saddest verses in all of Scripture. He came unto his own, and his own people did not receive him. It was kind of the illustration that I was trying to describe with the children and the fort as well, right? That Jesus steps into the world to be the fulfillment of all that God has promised, and his own people did not even recognize him. But he says this, he says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And when John says among us, he doesn't mean all of us, right? He doesn't even mean all Christians. He's being very specific so that we understand that what he's talking about is something he experienced. He doesn't mean us, we. He means he, we. He means the disciples, right? That's the us that he's talking about. He's like, we actually experienced what I'm about to describe to you. Everything that we're about to say from here on out, the disciples actually experienced. He became flesh, he dwelled among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Full of grace and truth. And so this is the thing that we kind of, I think, have to wrestle with as Christians, is we wrestle with this idea of grace and truth, right? And on the face of it, we know what these things are, right? Truth says, hey, you have to be accountable. Grace says, but you're still loved and forgiven. And grace says, hey, you're okay the way you are. And truth says, no, you're broken, right? And we all have different experiences with grace and truth in our life. We all grew up with different degrees of it, right? You probably had a parent who was more grace and you had one that was more truth. And so if you wanted to spend the night at your friend's house, you went and asked Gracie, not Truthy. You asked Gracie if you could do it, right? And now if you grew up, if you were blessed to have a combination of both, that leads for a healthy childhood. If you grew up where you had two truth people, I'm sorry. And if you grew up where you had two grace people, you're not here because you're probably in prison. So it is a challenge, really, right? This tension between grace and truth. And what John says, I don't want us to miss this. He says, for from his fullness we have received grace upon grace. And so for us to even tackle this topic of grace and truth, we have to understand that John is saying that the beginning, the way we understand it, is that we have received from God, through his Son Jesus, grace upon grace. Grace to overflowing. Grace to cover everything that we're going to talk about. Because we have to approach it from that understanding, or we're going to get this wrong. The understanding that God has given grace upon grace to us. And he says this, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And this is so important, and it's so easy to miss. I just want you to look at that. The law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And that root word in Greek, the came one, is the same one that is begotten, that the King James would translate as begotten. So if you were with us at all during our summer series where we looked at a bunch of the Old Testament, right? We know what it means when we say God's law came through Moses, right? The things that you're supposed to do, the expectations that God has as his chosen people. But we also saw how well that worked, right? We only got like halfway through the Old Testament, and it was a dumpster fire, right? They're disobeying him left and right. He has to keep sending different people, right, to try to fix things. And what John is saying now is that the law was given through Moses, but the fulfillment, the bringing together of grace and truth was begotten, was brought into this world in the person of Jesus. Not in an idea, not in a concept, not in a belief system, not in a behavior, in an actual person. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And what John is actually saying to us is that Jesus is the perfect embodiment of both. That Jesus is not grace or truth. He is grace and truth. And I want to look at just 4 stories real quickly to kind of show you what this looks like. One of them comes from the book of John. You might be familiar with it, where Jesus is alone at this well. His disciples have gone into food. He's actually in Samaria. So the Samaritan woman is at the well, and it's around noon. She's gathering water, and Jesus starts this conversation with her, right? Hey, will you get me some water from with your bucket, and they get into this conversation, and Jesus says to her, hey, why don't you bring your husband so that I can meet him as well. And she says, I don't have a husband. And Jesus goes immediately to the darkest part of her life. He goes straight to the most broken part of her life. He says, yeah, you don't have a husband. In fact, you've had 5 husbands, and the guy you're with now isn't even your husband, right? And if we would have been there, like just watching this interaction take place, we would have been like, wow, did he skip PR at seminary? Right? I mean, that's not, you don't start a conversation with someone in that way, right? But he goes straight, he is truth at this moment, and he goes straight to what her brokenness is, right? And he says, look, you have never understood what it's meant to be with a man. In fact, probably what he's reading in there is that to her, a husband has been an idol, right? A thing to complete her or fix her or whatever it might be. But she's had husband after husband after husband, and Jesus says that's never solved what the hole that is in your heart, your brokenness. But then he does something, I don't know if you ever caught this, that he does almost nowhere, right? Think about how time and time again people are always demanding, are you the Messiah, are you the one? And he's always vague about it. To this Samaritan woman by himself, he says, I'm the Messiah. The one that you are waiting for, I'm right here. He actually reveals himself to be the one. And he says to her that if you come to me, then springs of living water will overflow into your life. That grace is going to be what fixes you, not chasing the next thing to fill the hole. And this interaction with her is so profound. Do you know the rest of the story? She gets up, goes into town, and tells everyone what's just happened. And if she tells everyone what just happened, that includes admitting what? Her brokenness. So Jesus has this strange interaction where grace and truth collide, and we think to ourselves, wow, that's so messy. And then we think about Matthew, right? We've unpacked this the last couple of falls, so I won't spend a ton of time on it, but Matthew is a tax collector, right? And they're thought of, if it's even possible, less kindly than we think of tax collectors nowadays, right? In fact, you've heard this phrase from the New Testament, right? Jesus eats with tax collectors and sinners. That means that they had this group of people that considered sinners, and that wasn't bad enough, so that tax collectors had to have their own category. Tax collectors and sinners. That's how bad we are, right? And Jesus comes along and he says, Matthew, you're going to be a tax collector. I know you're a tax collector. You're going to be a disciple now. And the rest of the disciples have to be going, what? Jesus, what? If you let a tax collector hang out with us and be one of your disciples, people are going to think that you condone the Roman tax collecting system. If he's with us, people are going to assume you're okay with it. Jesus, he can't be with us. People will think I'm okay with it. And Jesus goes, buckle up. It's only going to get worse. We're going to his house. Yeah, we're going to eat with him. And the disciples are like, no, Jesus, we can't eat with the tax collector. People will think we're totally fine with his lifestyle. Goes, oh, Jesus says, he won't be the only one there. He's going to have a bunch of friends. What kind of friends? More tax collectors, right? And the disciples have to be saying, what, Jesus, what is this going to say about our movement, about your reputation, about our reputation? And his answer, of course, to them is, I didn't come to save a reputation. I have come for the sick. And Matthew and the tax collectors and all the disciples are the sick. The next one to think about is the thief on the cross. I don't really know even why the translators ever translated this as thief, because they didn't crucify thieves. In the Roman world, they had lots of places they needed free labor. They needed slaves. So most criminals were put to work, right? You were rowing in a Roman galley, you had to work in some mine, you had to do something, right? Crucifixion was reserved for those that they could not ever get to cooperate. These are your worst of the worst. These are usually the ones who incited a rebellion or something like that, right? So there's these two of them that are on both sides of Jesus. And Jesus, you remember the one cries out to Jesus and he says, hey, why don't you save us? And the other replies, he says, look, we're getting what what we deserve. He's done nothing, right? And we would expect Jesus, if he's going to be all gracie, to say, oh, no, you've got a good heart, right? But no, he acknowledges it. Yeah, you are getting what you deserve. But in the next moment, he says, would we close our eyes to this world and open them to the next, we will be together. You will be with me in paradise, right? And all of his followers are like, wait a second. Just a couple weeks ago, this rich guy came to see you, said he wanted to follow you, and you said he had to sell everything that he had and then follow you. And now this guy gets to go in under the buzzer? Like there's like 30 seconds left. He doesn't even have time to rededicate his life or make up for his like past sins. Jesus, this can't be the way it works. That's not fair. But Jesus acknowledges that he is a broken person, but also acknowledges that his faith in Jesus has led to this grace. And maybe the one that kind of grabs me the most is the woman caught in adultery, right? Remember the elders have gathered this, brought this woman to Jesus, and they've said, hey, she's been caught in adultery. I've never understood how she got caught in adultery, but she's going to be put to death according to the law of Moses. So they're doing this to test him, right? They're saying the law of Moses this says we should kill her. And Jesus could have actually just shut the whole thing down and go, yeah, but the Romans won't let us execute people, so get out of here, right? He could have just said that. I don't know if that's why the Romans had to execute Jesus. The Jews did not have the authority to execute anyone. So Jesus could have just done away with the whole thing and said, yeah, but the Romans won't let us get out of here. But he doesn't. He says, okay, fine. Let's stone her. Let me get out of the way first. And whoever of you is without sin, go ahead and throw the first stone. Whichever one of you has never committed adultery in your heart, whichever one of you has never, looked lustfully at a woman, whichever one of you has never been discontent with what God has given you, go ahead, throw the first stone. And of course, he looks up after a little while and everyone is gone. And he says to her, does no one condemn you? And she says, no. And he says, neither do I. Go and leave your sin behind. To which we go, wait, what? Well, which is it? Is it, I don't condemn you, or you're a sinner? And Jesus says, yes. No, am I not condemned, or am I a sinner? And Jesus says, yes. I don't condemn you, but leave your life of sin behind. And this is where it gets so difficult for all of us, right? This is the challenge of where do our grace and truth come together? And how are they lived out? And I'm going to go back to something I said at the very beginning of this series. If you want to understand what Jesus meant by what Jesus said, you watch what Jesus did. And when he brings together these things, these concepts, these ideas of grace and truth, he is bringing them both together in equal measures. It's not either or. And brothers and sisters, that's how we all are, right? I mean, I'm your pastor. I know all this Greek and Hebrew. I could stand up here and just bash it over the head all day, and you guys would be like, he said it was in the Greek or Hebrew. I don't know. I guess we better do what he says, right? Right? And I could, apply the truth. How many of you are firstborn in your family? You have siblings, but you're the firstborn. You've just confessed to being a truther. The natural inclination of your heart, and I'm one too, is a truther. And I got to tell you, I'm totally comfortable standing here and pointing truth out to you guys. I'm fine with that. Now, if we're going to have a conversation where you're going to talk to me, that should be grace. When we apply it to others, we like truth. When it's being applied to us, we like grace. When it's a sin we don't struggle with, we like truth. When it's a sin we struggle with, we like, right? If it's something that the world is doing and we don't understand, we like truth. If it's something that I've struggled with my whole life, we like grace. And Jesus comes along, and he absolutely will not allow us to separate those. And so this is what I'd suggest you that it means to be grace and truth. Jesus called sin, sin. He didn't say it's not sin. He said it's sin. And this is the danger for us if we just abandon the truth. Because what God's word says to us is that sin does have a gotcha. That he's taken away, right? Jesus has paid the price for our sin. The punishment our sin deserves is removed. But that doesn't mean there aren't effects to it. And so when Jesus says to us to leave our life of sin behind, it's not so that we can go to heaven. It's not so that we can get saved. It's for us. Because we're chasing after something that can never fulfill us. And to me, this is, I think, the hardest part right now of being a Christian church and trying to be both grace and truth. It is just like we do with our own personal lives, we kind of tend to do it corporately, right? There are certain sins that we think are outside of being part of the church, but then there's grace for the ones that we have inside the church. The problem is if we just say, well, there's no truth, then people will be chasing something that will never satisfy them. But if we say you have to follow the truth before you get the grace, they'll never find the one thing that is going to fill them. John, looking back on his life all those years later, was able to say, we have received grace upon grace. And that's the only thing that helps us live grace and truth. So my question for reflection this week is this: which do you need to work on more as a disciple of Jesus? Grace or truth? And if you've been paying attention and you know how ornery I am, you know that the answer to this question is both. Grace and truth. Jesus comes along and says to us, I know you struggle with sin. And maybe you can't leave it behind. Maybe you won't leave it behind. But I still love you. Jesus comes to us and says, I know that you are living with the effects of sin in your life, a brokenness, a hole, something that you're chasing, but I love you no matter what. That's why we can never, ever let go of grace and truth.